I was raised in a home that most people would consider to be nice. My father, who made his career by selling farm equipment, had risen from poverty to establish his own business. We never had to worry about money because he was not just excellent at it, but extremely amazing at it. My mother, well, she was a quite different matter. Dad was okay with her never working a day in her life. He wanted her to enjoy the life he had created for us and to be content. However, there wasn't much actual housework in Mom's definition of a housewife. Rather, she spent her days going shopping, going to the salon, and meeting up with her pals incessantly. Because Dad loved Mom so much, he let her to get away with almost everything, including going on shopping sprees, drinking with her friends, and occasionally forgetting to pick me up from school. He would just sigh and explain things to her. Everything began to alter when I was 9 years old. Due to a significant customer in another state, Dad had to travel for work. I could see he didn't want to go, but he was at a loss for options. I overheard him conversing with Mom in the kitchen before he left. "Sarah, please remember Rita needs to be picked up at 3:15, he stated. "Set an alarm if you need to." Mom said, "James, I'm not an idiot. I can handle taking care of my own daughter for a few days." As it happens, she was unable to. The day began rather normally. 2 days had passed since Dad's departure, and everything had gone smoothly. However, Mom wasn't there when I left school that afternoon. After waiting for 15 minutes, I began to walk home. I had done it previously when Mom was running late, and it wasn't far. However, I discovered that this time was different when I arrived at our home. I had no key, and the home was securely secured. Our neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, noticed me standing there when she was out watering her flowers. "Oh, Rita, honey," she said, her expression uneasy. "Your mother, Caroline, and the entire group departed a few hours ago." They were discussing a wine-tasting occasion. I felt sick to my stomach. I tried contacting Mom on the emergency phone Dad had given me, but there was no response. I kept trying, but to no avail. As I sat on our front porch, the hours slowly passed. When it started to become cold, Mrs. Peterson handed me a jacket, but Mom hadn't arrived yet. At last, when night fell, I gave Dad a call. "Daddy," I said tremblingly, "Mom isn't home, she won't answer her phone, and I'm locked out. I'm on our porch right now. My well-being has been monitored by Mrs. Peterson." "Okay, listen carefully," Dad replied. "I'm now on my way home. See if you can spend tonight with Mrs. Peterson. I'll be there as quickly as I can." That evening, Mrs. Peterson prepared her guest room for me. I listened for the sound of Dad's automobile and could hardly sleep. After driving straight through from his business conference 3 states away, he drove into the driveway at approximately 2 in the morning. As he thanked Mrs. Peterson and drove me home, his expression was worn but resolute. In the living room, we waited. I resisted Dad's attempts to convince me to go to bed. When Mom entered, I wanted to see her face. We did not hear Mom's Mercedes coming into the driveway until 8:00 a.m., which is precisely 8:00 in the morning. Her makeup was smudged, and her beautiful dress was disheveled when she staggered to the main door. She had a wine cellar scent. Her hazy eyes widened as she spotted Dad seated in his recliner. She said, "James, what are you doing home?" What am I doing home? Even though Dad spoke quietly, I had never heard him so furious. Yesterday, our 9-year-old daughter was locked out of her home for hours. Her mother was too busy having a good time to remember her existence, so she had to remain with the neighbors. Mom made an effort to laugh it off. "Oh, please stop being so dramatic." "Rita is doing well, aren't you, my love?" I retreated as she grabbed for me. "Fine," Dad said, getting up so quickly that his chair brushed the floor. Sarah, she phoned me in tears. It took her hours to get in touch with you. What if she had suffered an injury? Mom complained. I just lost track of time as tears began to well up in her eyes. The girls and I were having such a nice time. The girls. The sound of Dad's words echoed throughout the home. Prior to the gals and their wine tastings, your daughter ought to arrive. What sort of mother do you have? Mom sobbed as she fell onto the couch. I apologize. I'm so sorry. I swear it won't happen again. After a week of Mom's sobs and assurances, Dad eventually warmed up, but something had altered irrevocably. When Dad wasn't there, I could see it in the way Mom looked at me, cold and aloof, as if I had done something wrong. She would embrace me and inquire about my day when Dad came home, putting up a show of maternal devotion. However, her smile would disappear as soon as he turned away. That's how the 7 years went, with Mom treating me like an intruder whenever Dad wasn't there. I learned to avoid being alone with her by staying in my room and making myself scarce. Our delicate family equilibrium totally collapsed when I was 16 years old. It began when Dad was ill. Initially, it was nothing really concerning, simply some weight loss and weariness. However, we realized something was amiss when he began experiencing persistent stomach aches. Unable to determine what was going on, the physicians performed test after test. We were finally diagnosed with a rare kind of cancer after what seemed like an infinite number of medical trips. Mom pretended to be worried while people were looking, but when she felt like no one was paying attention, I could hear her actual emotions. She would pace the kitchen while whispering to her friends on the phone, "It's just so exhausting." Are you aware of how many unique dinners I now have to prepare? And he's at home all the time. He always asks me where I'm going when I leave the house. It's similar to being incarcerated. Her complaints about caring for her dying spouse would make my blood boil as I stood in the hallway. I didn't tell Dad, though. Even without knowing that his wife considered him a burden, he already had plenty to worry about. For a year, Dad tried to keep everything normal. He'd sit in his home office, making business calls between treatments, pretending the cancer wasn't slowly eating away at him. I'd bring him tea and sit with him, watching him put on a brave face for his employees and clients. Then one day, he called Mom and me into his office. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw his face. "I'm selling the business," he said without preamble, his hands folded on his desk. "The doctors, they've told me I don't have much time left." His voice cracked slightly. "Maybe a few months." I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. "No, Daddy, no." The tears came instantly, and I couldn't stop them. "Rita, sweetheart," Dad reached for my hand. "I need to do this. Neither of you could run the company after I'm gone. You're too young, and your mother, well, it's not her field. I won't let everything I built crash and burn. At least this way, I can make sure you're both taken care of." Mom made a show of crying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, but I caught her checking her phone while Dad wasn't looking. Her tears were as fake as her designer handbags. The weeks that followed were brutal. Dad got weaker by the day. I started rushing home from school, dropping my backpack at the door, and heading straight to his room. Sometimes I'd do my homework sitting next to his bed. Other times I'd just hold his hand while he slept. The nurse, Mrs. Rodriguez, was there during the day, making sure Dad took his medications and helping him eat. But Mom, she was barely around. When she did show up, she'd wrinkle her nose and complain about the hospital smell in the house. "I just can't handle being here all the time," she told me one day, applying lipstick in the hallway mirror. "The smell of sickness, it's everywhere. I need to get out to breathe." What she meant was she needed to party, to shop, to pretend her husband wasn't dying upstairs. When Dad's condition got so bad they had to move him to the hospital, Mom stopped coming home at night completely. She'd breeze in at dawn, looking suspiciously happy for someone whose husband was dying in a hospital bed. One morning, I couldn't take it anymore. "Where were you all night?" I demanded as she walked in wearing the same clothes as yesterday. "That's none of your business, young lady," she snapped. But I could smell the alcohol on her breath. "Dad is dying in the hospital, and you're out partying. How can you?" She cut me off, grabbing my arm hard enough to hurt. Her face was inches from mine. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the fury in her eyes. "Listen to me very carefully," she hissed. "You're going to keep your mouth shut and show me some respect. Otherwise, I promise you, I will make your life a living hell. Don't test me, Rita. You won't like what happens if you do." Dad died on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week before my 18th birthday. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath, while Mom was getting coffee somewhere in the hospital. At the funeral, she put on quite a show. She wore a designer black dress and dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, accepting condolences with a trembling voice. "He was my everything," she kept saying to anyone who would listen. "I don't know how I'll go on without him." But the moment the last mourner left the cemetery, it was like someone had flipped a switch. The tears dried up instantly, and she was checking her phone, smiling at text messages while we rode home in the funeral car. The next week was surreal. I walked through school like a zombie, barely able to focus on classes. My friends tried to comfort me, but how do you explain to people your age what it feels like to lose your father while watching your mother act like she'd just been released from prison? When my birthday came around, I didn't expect much, but I at least thought she'd acknowledge it. She didn't. I didn't even see her that day. She was gone before I woke up and hadn't come home by dinner. My friends took me to a small cafe downtown, bought me a cake, and tried to make me smile. It worked a little. I ended up staying at my best friend Jenny's house that night, not wanting to go home to an empty house on my birthday. The next morning, I walked into our kitchen to find Mom there with a man I'd never seen before. He looked maybe 35, a good 15 years younger than her, and had his arm wrapped around her waist like he owned the place. "Oh, good, you're here," Mom said, not even bothering to hide her annoyed tone. "Rita, this is Brad, my fiancé." I stood there, coffee mug frozen halfway to my mouth. "You're what?" "My fiancé," she repeated slowly, like I was stupid. "And now that you're here, we need to talk about arrangements." Arrangements? The word felt wrong in my mouth. "Yes, you need to leave," she smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. "Your father is gone now, and all his money is mine. I can finally live the way I want, with who I want." She squeezed Brad's arm. "And that doesn't include having a teenager around." "You're kicking me out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This is my house, too." "No, it's not." Mom marched upstairs and came back dragging my suitcase. She started throwing my clothes into it, not even bothering to fold them. "You're 18 now. I'm not legally required to support you anymore. I want you gone within the hour." "Mom, please don't." "Mommy," she snapped, shoving more of my belongings into the suitcase. "I've done my duty. I raised you. Now it's time for me to be happy." Standing on the sidewalk with my hastily packed suitcase, I felt completely lost. I had no grandparents, no aunts or uncles. Dad was an only child, and Mom's family had cut ties with her years ago for reasons she never explained. With shaking hands, I called Jenny. "Of course you can stay with me," she said immediately when I explained what happened, her voice full of concern and anger on my behalf. "My mom's been worried about you anyway." She actually mentioned last night that she was afraid something like this might happen. Come over right now. Jenny and her mom lived in a modest 3-bedroom apartment across town. They set me up on their pull-out couch in the living room, bringing out their nicest sheets, and even buying me new pillows. It wasn't much, but compared to being homeless, it felt like a luxury hotel. Jenny's mom hugged me tight and whispered, "Stay as long as you need, sweetheart." The next week passed in a blur as I threw myself into final exams, trying desperately to keep my grades up, even though my world was falling apart. I studied late into the night, partly because I needed to pass, but mostly because it kept me from thinking about my situation. I had no idea what I'd do after graduation. College seemed impossible now that I had no home and no money. Every time I thought about the future, panic would start to set in. Then Mrs. Peterson, our old neighbor, called. "Rita, honey," she said, her voice gentle but strained. "I thought you should know your mother is planning an engagement party at the house next weekend. She's been going all out, ordering catering, hiring decorators, the works." My stomach turned violently. An engagement party? Dad's been dead less than a month. His grave hasn't even settled yet. "I know, dear. I'm so sorry. I just thought you should know." She trailed off awkwardly. We both knew I hadn't been invited, hadn't even been told. "It's absolutely shameful," she added, anger creeping into her usually sweet voice. I spent the next few days alternating between rage and despair. How could Mom move on so quickly? How could she pretend Dad never existed while I was still crying myself to sleep most nights, still wearing Dad's old sweater because it smelled like him? She was planning a party to celebrate her engagement to a man young enough to be her son. 3 days after Mrs. Peterson's call, my phone rang again. This time it was a man identifying himself as Herbert Maxwell, a notary public. His voice was formal but kind, reminding me a little of Dad's business voice. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "I need you to come to my office as soon as possible. It's regarding your father's will. I've been trying to handle some matters remotely, but this requires your presence." When I arrived at his office downtown, Mr. Maxwell, a kindly-looking older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a grandfatherly demeanor, got straight to the point. His office smelled like old books and coffee, and somehow that was comforting. "Your father made some very specific arrangements before his death," he said, pulling out a thick folder and adjusting his glasses. "The house, all of its contents, and the entire proceeds from the sale of his business. Everything has been left to you, Miss Mitchell. Additionally, your father set up a trust fund specifically for your college education. He was very thorough in his planning." Mr. Maxwell reached into the folder and pulled out an envelope. "Your father also left this for you," he said, sliding it across the desk. "He was very specific that you should read it in private." With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Dad's familiar handwriting made my eyes well up immediately. "My dearest Rita, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I'm so sorry I had to leave you, sweetheart. There's so much I wanted to see, your graduation, your college years, your wedding someday. But life doesn't always give us what we want. What I can give you, though, is protection. I need to tell you something difficult. I've known for some time about your mother's affair. I've known about her lover, about her plans for my money after I'm gone. I heard her on the phone countless times, planning her future, a future that didn't include you. I want you to understand that this isn't revenge. This is me protecting my daughter, the only person who sat with me through my illness, who held my hand without complaint, who loved me unconditionally. Your mother will receive the car and the jewelry I bought her over the years. They're hers. But everything else, the house, the money from my business, everything It's yours. You can help your mother if you choose to. That decision is entirely yours to make. But I wanted to make sure she couldn't hurt you anymore, couldn't throw you out onto the street, or deny you an education. Love always, Dad. I clutched the letter to my chest, tears streaming down my face. Mr. Maxwell politely pretended to be very interested in organizing his papers. When I could speak again, a question occurred to me. Mr. Maxwell, why isn't my mother here for this? He cleared his throat uncomfortably. I tried to reach her multiple times. When I couldn't get through on the phone, I sent a formal letter about the reading of the will. She never responded. Of course she hadn't. She was too busy planning her engagement party, too caught up in her new life to care about anything related to her old one, including Dad's will. I left Mr. Maxwell's office in a daze, the folder of documents tucked under my arm, Dad's letter safe in my purse. When I got back to Jenny's apartment, I told them everything. Jenny hugged me so hard I could barely breathe, and her mom immediately grabbed her phone. This calls for celebration, she declared, pulling up a delivery app. I'm ordering from that fancy Italian place you girls love. Tonight we celebrate justice being served. The day of Mom's engagement party arrived exactly 1 month after Dad's funeral. I put on my best black dress, the one Dad had bought me for my last birthday, and did my makeup carefully. If I was going to crash a party, I was going to look good doing it. The house was lit up like a Christmas tree, with cars parked all along our street. Music and laughter spilled out onto the lawn. The front door wasn't even locked. Mom never was good about security. I walked right in. The living room was packed with people, most of them Mom's wine-drinking friends, all dressed up and holding champagne glasses. Brad's friends were easy to spot, young, trying too hard to look wealthy. The decorations were tasteless and excessive, like everything Mom did. She'd even taken down Dad's photos from the walls. Mom spotted me first. The color drained from her face before being replaced by rage. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, rushing over to me. "Get out now." She turned to her guests with a fake laugh. "Oh, everyone, this is my daughter. Poor thing can't accept that she needs to stand on her own 2 feet now. She's here to beg to come home. But I have to be firm. Tough love, you know." Her friends tittered with laughter. Brad's friends joined in. They all looked at me with that particular mix of pity and contempt that wealthy people reserve for those they consider beneath them. I smiled, not a nice smile, the kind of smile a shark might give if sharks could smile. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "I'm here to collect what belongs to me." Mom laughed mockingly. "Nothing here belongs to you anymore, dear. This is my house now." "No, Mom, it's not." I pulled the will from my purse and held it up. "This house belongs to me. So does everything in it. Dad left it all to me. The house, the business proceeds, everything. You get to keep your car and jewelry. That's it." The room went dead silent. Mom's face turned an interesting shade of purple. "You're lying," she sputtered. "Would you like to read it?" I offered sweetly. "Or should I call Mr. Maxwell, the notary, to confirm? Better yet, should I call the police to remove all these people who are currently trespassing in my house?" The guests started moving immediately, gathering their coats and bags, muttering awkward excuses. Nobody wanted to be part of this scene. Within minutes, the room had cleared, except for Mom and Brad. "Rita, sweetie." Mom's voice turned sugary. "We can work this out. We're family. Your father wouldn't want us fighting like this." I just shook my head and pointed to the door. "You're right about one thing, Mom. Dad wouldn't want us fighting. That's why he made sure we wouldn't have to. The door's that way." Mom didn't go quietly. She never did anything quietly. "You ungrateful little," she screamed, her perfect makeup running with angry tears. "After everything I've done for you." Brad stood awkwardly beside her, his eyes darting between Mom and me, then to the door like he was calculating his escape route. I noticed he'd stopped touching her, had actually taken a few steps away from her meltdown. "Everything you've done for me." I laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. Like abandoning me when I was 9? Like complaining about taking care of Dad when he was dying? Like throwing me out the day after my 18th birthday? By this point, neighbors had started gathering on our front lawn, drawn by Mom's screaming. Miss Peterson was there, along with the Johnsons from across the street and the Mendes from next door. They weren't even trying to hide that they were watching. "This isn't over." Mom grabbed her designer purse from the sofa. "I'll get a lawyer. I'll contest the will." "Good luck with that," I said calmly. Dad made everything legally bulletproof. But hey, feel free to waste whatever money you have left on lawyers. That's when I saw it, the moment Brad's expression changed. He looked at Mom like he was seeing her for the first time, and he didn't like what he saw. A broke, aging woman with no house, no inheritance, and no prospect of getting either. "Sarah," he murmured as he retreated to the door, "perhaps we ought to take a moment to think about everything." When Mom noticed what was occurring, her expression twisted. "Don't do this, Brad, sweetie. We can work something out." Brad, however, had already left, virtually rushing to his vehicle. He drove off without turning around, but Mom was still shouting and chasing after him. The neighborhood erupted in cheers. "It's about time." Mrs. Peterson yelled and approached me to give me a hug. "Your father would be so proud of you, honey." The neighbors approached one by one to offer their assistance. A dish was brought over by Mrs. Mendoza. "You can't live on takeout forever, Machetta." Just in case, Mr. John volunteered to assist me with changing the locks. Through the local grapevine, I learned tidbits about Mom throughout the course of the following several weeks. Brad had ended the engagement right away. Evidently, he had not committed to a lady who was impoverished and without a home. Mom attempted to stay with a number of friends, but they all abruptly became too busy to take her in. Her pricey pals vanished as fast as Dad's wealth did. She had relocated to Florida to live with a second cousin, the only family member willing to take her in, according to the last I heard. She made many attempts to phone me and left voicemails with cries, apologies, and begs for money. Her number was blocked by me. Dad always believed I would graduate high school with honors, and I did. When I crossed the stage, Jenny's mother and Mrs. Peterson, who were seated in the family section, cheered more loudly than everyone else. Dad put up a college fund that allowed me to attend whatever institution I wanted, so I decided to go to Dad's old mater, a top West Coast business school. I am a business administration major with agricultural studies as a minor. Like Dad, I could one day launch my own business. But for the time being, I'm just concentrating on creating the life I desire, free from Mom's destructive influence, and confident that Dad's final act was to ensure my well-being.